Here's my take on session 2 for the Whimsical Ways game in terms of situation and scenes and events in play. And the first thing to talk about is the things I forgot to mention in my presentation of session 1, which were relevant to that. So I have my list. And the first is, I guess, that one of the features of the preparation was in thinking about the mountainous environment and the sort of low-tech aspects of being Shkaza. And so I figured there's all sorts of creatures and dangers and so on in the mountains, and particularly for anyone who wandered off. So I went and I looked through the Legendary Lives book, which is full of creatures, and it has very usable little stat blocks for them. So I figured I'd go find something and maybe skin it up into some other shape or habits if necessary. And I found a couple of things that fit in pretty well as written. And one of them were boobries, which are these flightless birds, the creature that we all remember from our looking at Pleistocene books when we were kids, and then lo and behold, we find them in the D&D Monster Manual as well, the Axbeak, as they were called, and we've seen them through role-playing games ever since. They're kind of awesome. So effectively, that sort of creature. And then something that, I don't know how you say it, Afonk, perhaps, which is some hideous crocodile whirlpool monster. And I figured that was just right for being in the lower waters of the region that we're talking about. So, boobry nests are scattered about, and the Afonk is, lurking in the water. There's one of them. It's all it's needed, believe me. And I figured anything else could just be sort of, the flotsam and jetsam of regular wildlife with no surprises in terms of special abilities. So anyway, I had figured that out already and sort of had those about. Now, in the beginning of play, one of the things I've done in the design for Whimsical Ways is replace devotion, which in Legendary Lives is very important. All the characters have access to divine magic, and they all have a devotion score that can do it. And it's a very significant part of play. Removing that from Whimsical Ways, which is, for lack of a better word, somewhat more cynical about the metaphysical personages that may or may not, be there. Anyway, I switched it to a social phenomenon, which I'm calling regard. So now each type has a regard score base that you roll and add to, and it is very much used as a contextual thing. It's a bit like charm in Circle of Hands, but in a slightly different, less immediate consequence. So anyway, I should have rolled that for both characters, and in particular, I ended up rolling charm or something, or calling for a charm roll or something similar from 13 in exactly the time when I should have said regard. And that's important because just like in Circle of Hands, although the details differ, but just like in that game, it is a big part of what in other games would be called prep. It's definitely a piece of the situation that you need to consult in the context of moment-to-moment play as you go along. Okay, the regard roll was good, so when they talk to this person, what are the parameters for that person's behavior that other roles may be made in. So anyway, that's game design for you, though. You think up something and then you don't do it and say, oh, that's where you do it. Or you are playing and you do it and you're like, oh, geez, that rots, and let's do that differently, like right now sometimes. So anyway, there's a couple of instances of that scattered through the Whimsical Ways sessions, all of them, which may sort of muddy the waters of looking at some of my decision making. Sometimes I'm encountering places where there should be a rule or some framework of consultation, and sometimes I am applying something which isn't going particularly well, which is good for playtesting, but not so good for teaching technique with sessions as a case study. Well, anyway, all that said, what else are we talking about that I missed or didn't do? I forgot to mention that upon the conclusion of the Thioxa and Ogox emotional, logjam that they walked themselves into, or talked themselves into, that Ogox concluded in that very moment, the relic's going back into the temple, and if it's stuck in the sword, it'll just go with it. The sword will go with it until such a time. Besides, Thioxa's less dangerous with that sword not immediately to hand at all times. Maybe Thioxa needs a little managing these days. So that's what Ogox did, and so I ended up recognizing this, or in making sure it was instantiated into play, fancy word, when they were on their way to the temple and things were looking, there's a brawl up there. And I remembered to ask Noah, did you or did you not, seek your sword on the way? Because I didn't want to zoom into what you do moments, which we were, just about to jump into, if Noah was fully presuming that Thioxa had her sword. And therefore I would say, oh, you don't have it. And that would not be good. That's a mismatch of thought. And so we have to be sure about that. So I said, just in time, did you bring your sword? Because if not, then I could have backed it up a little bit and say, okay, before you guys get there, we have to resolve this business if they're going to confront Ogox about where's my sword. But interestingly, Noah said, oh, no, I didn't bother. I guess I left it or didn't think about it. And I was like, oh, well, okay then, because when you go for it, it's not there. And I'm thinking to myself, and it's zipped off to the temple. So letting you know that had been a part of play, that was a piece of our interaction and my thoughts on something Ogox did. I'm not trying to hide it from Noah. Fortunately, catching the communication in time so that I didn't hide it by accident. So, okay. I think that catches us up regarding session 1. Moving into session 2. Now, one of the interesting features of role-playing is that sessions may or may not be units of some kind. It depends on the game. It depends on sometimes that particular transition during a given game. And I was looking at the end of session 1 and thinking, did the players really grasp that Shkazak had kind of smoothed down, the riot, that Ogox's proclamation and Shkazak saying, listen, I'll just take over the management of this robot, unto such a time as we get to this final defiance, that had sort of settled down the crowds, and that there wasn't, an ongoing brawl? Or do they think that we're still in a brawl? Because I was looking at the end of the session and I wasn't sure that had actually been communicated and received back to me from the way that they talked. So what I did was, in this case, instead of making a decision that the session break would also be a scene break, because it doesn't have to be, as we all well know. And I decided to ask them and say, what did you want to do? I mean, I won't close the scene if you don't want me to, but I do have a justification for closing the scene, and just basically having a little bit of a scene break at the same time as our session break. And they both said, oh, no, we are in that scene and we have the stuff to do. We want to keep playing it. So that's what we did. But I had asked them in between or just before we played I think you can see it in the beginning of session 2, that this is something that I wasn't really sure myself whether I was supposed to be putting a little time and space break and starting up a new scene, or whether we were still on the steps of plazas of the pyramid with a whole bunch of uneasy and somewhat shocked different characters for different reasons. So, okay, that is what we did. But we're really here to talk about the blue arrows and the gold arrows and the A's and the B's and black arrows and all that. So I've got my little thing out here, and I will stay with that whole session scene transition for just one more second by pointing out that it has nothing to do with that. It's just a scene transition, or the lack of a scene transition, that could have happened, and the same question asked, like in the middle of a session. So no big deal. However, when we do start a new scene, then we have to consult the situation to do so. And in this case, because we had the big yellow arrow, which I mistakenly called B in the last video, it's not arrow B. It's the big arrow that goes up. Since we had the big arrow, which in my diagram changes the color of the situational arrows going forward, the ones up top, that means that when we go to a new scene, whatever the break is consisting of, the blue arrow of the break, whether it's a big change in time or a little change in time, just shifting over to look at a different place or whatever it is. But you consult the situation and you're thinking, where are we? Who's there? What is that contextual situation that the relevant characters know about or are acting upon, or interestingly are ignorant of, and so they're acting differently? What is all this? Who's there and how are they feeling? And in that context, this new A coming down is a pretty distinctive one, because it's dealing with the new now of the situation that it's embedded in. So here we're in, what is the nature of this? What's the content of this new A arrow this time? First of all, I had mentioned before, and here's the main one, is the forced power play for Ogox. She has been forced to feels forced anyway, to take a much more substantial policy position than she wanted to. And she's furious with Thioxa for jumping into the brawl the way she did on 13's side, the other side. So I'm loaded for bear with Ogox. I am just like lay into Thioxa with everything I've got. And it's all about, can Thioxa even fathom where Ogox is coming from? And I roleplay. You can see the session. I'm speaking very much from the heart at this point. And before we move into that, because that's the little black arrows inside the box, inside the scene. Who says what, who does what, any roles that are necessary. If not, but things will change along as we play with the scene. At the very least, a character will walk from here to there or something. But before we do that, here's the other context for that new A coming down from the situation and setting up all the context for anybody doing anything in this scene. And I had mentioned that last session too, which is that various roles and their results had given the two doubles, the other robot and the other Vargar, Shkaza, we say now, freedom of activity. The player characters know nothing about them, and no other character there has any reason to think this is strange, especially, unless they see that other robot. So therefore, so you can think of the other Shkaza, the double Shkaza, the killer, as kind of lurking around, just being kind of, scullion in the background sort of character. So I had those on my mind. So one of the things I was thinking about is, what are those two up to as we go through session 2? And that became relevant a bit later. So with those, that's my A, right? And oh man, there's more to talk about. Okay, the whole backdrop of like the whole setting and the Shkaza in general, and some of the other, just whimsical ways, textually speaking, or conceptually in my mind, that the text at this point, doesn't particularly express, just reminds me, is that some aspects of that had twisted on me a bit. I had originally conceived of the Shkaza religion very much as Sithrak in the racy cartoon comic strip called Oglath. I love Sithrak, and had thought, okay, their religion is like Sithrak. This is hilarious. But it's kind of twisted on me a little bit, so that only one of the factions is Sithrak-like, and that one isn't in our scenario, because that's the Shkaza who travel all around being evangelists or proselytizers, and they're not here. And the other two had really turned into sort of Catholics and Protestants on me, and I was sort of shifting, how they looked at the deity, because the evangelicals really do worship the cruel God. And I'm saying that these two factions, instead of worshiping, are very much about defiance, very, very anti. So, even though everything they do is just like an ordinary religion. So that's the funny there. But anyway, that had kind of changed up on me, just letting you know that through the course of the first session of play, expressing these things that I had written down very superficially, that's how they made the most sense in expression. So I'd actually gone back and actually redone, some of that text between the two sessions. Like, oh, so that's what I meant. So that had twisted on me. And one more thing, because I've been thinking about, okay, now that the sword has been whisked away, where is it? Where is this temple? Remember, I had that little map that I showed you, and I was thinking, well, and I was vague on this. I was thinking, well, maybe it's like off, it's another building off somewhere. But we had this cool ass pyramid and everything, and I'm kind of like, this huge pyramid temple. I mean, it's got an inside, doesn't it? So I was thinking that, that room had been, was socked into the pyramid somewhere. But that's what I was thinking at the time, which was not really all that satisfying. I mean, it's a rectangular room. It's got kind of a church above ground look to it. It doesn't look like the inside of a pyramid, but it's all I had at the time. So I was thinking, well, let's stick it in there. And since this is, really special, it's a secret entrance. That's kind of cool, right? I mean, Ogox has her sort of churchy place inside the pyramid, that only her people go to. Kind of like that. So that's what I had in mind at the time of this session. So I think, boy, that's a whole lot of that A I've finally managed to go through my list on. So we've had the events now to consider. So what happened as we began to play? Thing number one, Thiaxa did tell 13 that she should go with Shkazak, that Noah figured that even though Thiaxa doesn't like Shkazak, and vice versa, it's still safer for 13 with that faction than it is with any of the church faction, for all Thiaxa knows are going to try to sacrifice 13, today. So that's what Noah decided. So that's where 13 goes, which gives me time for a little more walk and talk chat with Shkazak, which I kind of wanted in some fashion or another, that Shkazak has ideas now. He's been thinking. It's like, first of all, types in the game, in this case, killer for 13 and specialist for Thiaxa, those aren't in fiction in Legendary Lives, and they're not that in fiction for Whimsical Ways either. They are identity. And so you might say, if somebody whose type is a knight That doesn't mean the person has to run around socially being what people call a knight, or that might not even exist for that person's culture or for that whole setting. No, they are knightly. And people will recognize this, and they get special abilities. I mean, all sorts of rules come with your type, but it isn't. But it's a thematic thing that people respond to. It is not an in-fiction designation like a profession or something. Legendary Lives is explicit about saying this in the text, and then with its types, it tends to fumble a little bit. So you end up with merchants and acrobats and stuff like that. But here, in the types for Whimsical Ways, I was very careful about this, and I really wanted to bring it forward. What I'm really trying to say here is that 13's type as a killer isn't a secret. Maybe a lot of people don't articulate it to themselves, and nobody says, "Oh, well, that's an assassin," like, an assassin in D&D or Assassin's Creed, where you got the black scarves and 15 knives and all that kind of stuff. No, that's not what I mean. But the idea is that for someone who would really like someone assassinated, intuitively saying, "And that robot would do that," is part of a type. Shkazak's right on board with this one, right? He's like, "Ooh, I have a use for that robot." And therefore the walk and talk showing 13 the human meat farm, especially because I really liked the idea that the use of humans in this kind of domesticated meat way is actually pretty similar to one interpretation of 13's own religion, which is considering humans the holy flesh of robotdom. In other words, the sexual organs, the reproductive part of robots is humans. So therefore, to 13, at least from that point of view, there's at least Shkazak is kind of hoping for some common ground that they can talk about. Maybe a way to make humans docile, something that 13 might like. Now, all of this is tricky because the backdrop of the game that's accessible to players at this time, in the middle of this kind of playful play, crappy little notes, flying every which way, as I try to figure out what I wrote and what I meant, isn't ideal for picking up backdropy stuff and seeing how much you want to incorporate it or how your character feels about it individually. So that's another feature of playing with a game very much in casual development, is that certain backdrop things that work really strongly for me in terms of what Shkazak is up to may not be as clear or obvious to the player that they get to take that content and think about it. At least not at that level. I mean, now I have Robot and Shkazak write-ups after playing all of this, which I think are much more accessible, and a player reading those very briefly even is kind of loaded for interactions like that. At the time we did this, nobody was. So I'm not saying it was a terrible interaction or whatever, but definitely, Helma played 13 real cool. And I don't know if they even picked up on Shkazak really wanting to do a quid pro quo about this. Not during this session. So there was the, bit of chit chat about it, and that's fine. Now, in the case of Thioxa, responding to Ogox, who is being extremely clear, and from the standpoint of this person playing Ogox, rather fair, and in her outrage. Interestingly enough, Noah played Thioxa basically as emotionally lashing back. And now we look at the arrows. What is Shkazak going to do? What is Ogox going to do? What is the social situation going to be like? And in those particular cases, I played from there. I played Shkazak as doing his level best to maintain control over the robotic, context to where 13 was, wanted 13 watched, wanted 13 taken care of, kept happy, definitely kept away from Ogox. Um, so that's why I had the character Raga and stuff like that, who I'd introduced earlier, and many things of this kind. Now, for Ogox, on the other hand, she's had it. She has had it. She did her level best. And her lover is just being, well, a bad word. And is just like this close. It's kind of in the one last chance relationship mode before she basically, if she can't if Skazak's going to protect the robot, and if the Oxa doesn't actually show some kind of emotional awareness about any of this relationship, someone else can do the final defiance just as easily. Thank you very much. So that's kind of where I'm at with these two non-player characters, and some of the context that they have a lot of social pull, both of them. So it's not just them, it's a whole bunch of other characters who can lend their muscle and observation to what these characters want. So that's where I was, that's where the Black Arrows led me. Now we move into finally, those were more scenes technically, but in terms of a break in time, a breather for a moment, fade out, fade in somewhere else a little later. In terms of these really explicit scene transitions, I'm in the moment realizing that the other robot and the other Skaza are doing what they're doing, which is basically stealing the relic. They're trying to set up to get into the temple and steal the relic. And I'm also thinking about Ogox, who is making this difficult by being at the temple and sort of setting up for the final defiance for whoever's going to get it. But it's going to be one of those two, depending on how they act, the Oxa specifically. So that means I've got NPCs like wandering around doing things by themselves. And so turn to the player characters, and it's like, look, I got nobody dropping in the skylight on your head. What are you doing now that there's, some breather here? What's going on? You can see the session to see what the players said and what happened because of it. But to summarize here, they both get lost, which is kind of interesting in lots of ways. For one thing, I didn't really quite have it clear in my mind what a failed locate, the killer special ability, what the failed locate ability, or rather its gradations of success and failure for that matter. What does that mean? So I was thinking, that's, I should understand locate a little bit better, shouldn't I? And then also luck and intuition are important rules in Legendary Lives. No, fate, not luck. Fate and intuition. I think I said luck wrong, like during the session itself a couple of times. But in Legendary Lives, those are very much GM control techniques. In Whimsical Ways, they are usable, but they need to have bounce for the GM rather than, the GM's hand of chess piece moving, to sort of an excuse for the GM to put you where you should be. And I was, working out what that felt like and things like that. So here we are using all these mechanics that are highly scene making, right? Where the character is and who's there and under what circumstances are all wrapped up in the way these roles turn out. So I found myself thinking, how do these work? And the danger here is making up something cool and saying, oh, well, the role got us here. Right? You say, what will be interesting to happen next? Or what will move things along so that you're kind of backing toward that thing you would like to have happen, or would even are kind of determined to have happen. And you're kind of backing toward it and sort of like doing this to the, to the players to have them come along. And these pseudo roles are kind of your excuse for getting them there. So that's what I know I'm not doing. And so I'm really trying to say, what's the internal logic of what locate, and fate rolls do. So, for better or for worse, the conclusion at the time was that 13 gets a good enough roll, so that I think that she's going to gain some. She can gain some information out of this. This can actually be turned out as kind of an inadvertent, kind of investigation style role in this case, and learning that Ogox has this secret temple entrance to the pyramid is solid info in this regard. Particularly because that's where the relic is, and the relic is relevant to the whole situation. So, all right, that's what I figured for 13, and then for Thioxa, who ended up in a much less good situation. The role was, at least the role for 13 was successful enough, to get somewhere. It just didn't nail getting actually right to where she wanted to be, to whom she wanted to be next to. But with Thioxa, and the fact that it wasn't a specialized locate role, it was more of a general role of fate, is just where did her luck place her? And it placed her somewhere bad. So, that happens. You're in danger. You're roaming around in a part of the area that, you don't know very well. And, well, fortunately, as previously mentioned, I have a very good idea of what happens to somebody who starts blundering about in this area, which, remember, is not a city and it's not a town. It is a frequently used encampment with ritual space and other things in it. I mean, they know the area well. It gets used well. There's, Shkaza community usage kind of impacting the place for generations. But a lot of it is untrammeled forest and mountainsides. You go, you get yourself off on the wrong trail in one of those, you're walking into a boobry nest. That's all there is to it. And sure enough, there she is standing there on a boobry nest with, the chick here and the parent there. And it was bad luck. She got a roll that said, your luck is bad. And I said, haha, standing in a boobry nest. That's what that means for you. So I was kind of pleased with the way prep and the nature of the rolls and everything kind of made sense at that time. So sure enough, though, we go ahead and have what you might think of as a monster fight with several glorious little rolls, particularly the chick pecking Thioxa in the face is beyond good. It's like, yeah, you're going to hold it in your hand and you're going to try and throw it away and it doesn't get thrown away. Well, it makes its attack on you and it's a good attack. So all sorts of fun. I mean, I just relived it just to enjoy myself over that one. So we end up with, Thioxa bleeding copiously from her face and stumbling back into the community. We end up with Ogox badly lying to 13 about, yep, nothing going on around here. Sort of almost doing the Shkaza equivalent of sort of, trying to get between 13 and any sign of that secret temple entrance. And the conclusion of that was merely to reestablish equilibrium, really. I mean, the two characters had finally found each other and had stuff to talk about, and they wanted to do that. So Ogox definitely wanted to get, out of, probably isn't all that happy that 13's wandering around, but definitely wants to get back to her own business as quickly as possible. Furthermore, is willing to give Thioxa one more chance, so therefore wants Thioxa attended to and to join her. That is where we ended up with the second session. Other things. Okay, so what am I really saying? What I'm saying is that we are talking about, okay, just like in my little diagram here, we're looking in that second box, and that new A with the change situation has come down, contextualized everybody's behavior, remotivated, Ogox in a particular way, remotivated Shkazak in a particular way, all those other things I talked about at length. But what I'm really focusing on right now are the black arrows inside. Not just roles. We're not doing automated play, but roles in the context of acknowledged constraints on a number of things. And we had different roles, in particular, very contextual, scene making roles, like locate, saying who is where, or luck. I keep saying that, or fate roles, or failed roles, such as the failed memory role. Was in this one? Yes, it was in session 2. The failed memory role for 13 to remember that Scullion character. And she rolled just well enough, or badly enough, to remember there was something weird. There was somebody who looked like her. Them. I noticed 13's gender wavered slightly through play. But anyway, 13 remembered that there was somebody who reminded them of themselves and can't remember who. So failed rolls, successful rolls, different degrees according to the ladder from Legendary Lives that I'm using. All of those were, in this case, not so much about, hit or miss, although that did show up with the Boobries, but much more about what's going on and who knows what and who is where. So those kinds of roles are happening, creating a complex of who has seen what, who is thinking about what, that made the beginning of that scene and its sub-scenes, I guess you could call them, and the black arrows that, proceeded forward, bringing us to a very different state so that I could look at the end of the box and think about the next blue arrow into whatever we were going to start with next time, as something I could do and say, all right, well, with all these things that have happened, there is linear momentum. There is, well, I don't know about linear, but forward momentum. And again, in full knowledge that the robot and the Shkaza doubles are very freed up. I mean, Ogox really should be keeping an eye on that relic and stuff in the temple, but she really wants to talk to Theoxa for this one last chance. It's actually pulled her away from there. I mean, the other robot and the other Shkaza are like, hot diggity at this point. We're on it, get that relic now. So that's about session 2. It's where I ended up. And the thinking about situations and scenes.